David, I'm delighted that we've got part two, been able to get together for part two of our interview.
Good.
To go over some of the topics that we weren't able to quite cover yesterday.
Good.
So I look forward to some more, racketeering and storytelling, and that adds to the comments and the topics that we went over the other day. So
you talked about memorable things that had involved Red Deer in the Red Deer Hospital, kind of over the years, and there are a lot of things that certainly happened that were quite amazing. One that I will certainly never forget was the night that the newborn baby was kidnapped. It turned out that it was a lady who was mentally ill, who walked into the hospital one evening, and she went into the doctor's room and found a white coat with a doctor's label. And she put the coat on and walked down to the nursery and picked up a baby and took it. This was discovered quite quickly, within a matter of 15-20 minutes. It was discovered and, of course, resulted in tremendous response almost immediately. And all of the doors to the hospital were closed. And there were 3 or 4 senior people that were in the hospital within no time at all. And they did a search everywhere. And they finally they found the baby abandoned in a bathroom. And I don't recall exactly how the kidnapper was eventually identified, but she was found to be mentally quite seriously ill, and so that was an event that was quite sobering and turned out to have a good outcome, but was absolutely unforgettable for everybody who was involved in that.
I'm not sure that story did it reach the press or become fairly well advertised? Those are not the kind of stories that really improve your reputation.
Well, that's true, and certainly, as time goes by, issues that pertain to security and privacy and things like that have undergone quite considerable change and have tightened up a great deal. I mean, I think that this was one of those things that at that point in time, nobody envisioned that it could occur. Nobody imagined that anyone would do this. Mm-hmm. And of course, after it had happened, then measures were put in place to prevent it from ever happening again. Amongst other things, a lock was put on the doctor's room door.
I've noticed that. It's not so easy to get in there.
That's right.
Impersonate.
Well, it's interesting about locks. Door locks almost invariably keep out the people who have every reason to get in, and sometimes fail to keep out the people that really should never get in.
You're kind of reminding me. One of the subjects I wanted to go over was a bit about the hospital's evolution, and a short story I'll add to that. But let me linger on what we had started before, which was to talk about some significant events and memorable events that happened within or without the hospital. Like the Pine Lake story that you were filling us in on. Are there any others that you well remember that positive or negative?
Oh boy. Let me give that just a moment's thought.
Well, while you're doing that, I can't resist a brief story about my own association with the hospital, or I think it was known as the 50 wing or thereabouts. My father, after the war, ran for council and was elected. And I don't know whether he got his pick or he was assigned to the hospital board. So he ended up on the hospital board. Well, they were having trouble with the government because they wanted money for a new wing. So the current chairman resigned. And Dad ended up as the board chairman, which is a little unusual for the councillor. And I remember going with him to try to get money from the government, from Deputy Minister McCallum and so on. And he was successful. And they got the 53 wing, I think it was at that time. But the other thing I remember about it, to linger on your comment about security, is that visiting hours were very specific and limited, like 7 to 8 in the evening. And if you couldn't fit into them, you weren't allowed. So there was some level of security.
Yes.
Well, Dad knew the rules. And Mother was in hospital, having just delivered brother Toby. And the only way to go and visit her at off hours was to go up the fire escape. So as kids, my identical twin brother and I would go up the outside, hang on the brick walls staircase, and Dad would open the door at the top so we could go in and see Mother at off hours. Because that was a time when the length of stay after delivery was 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It's not 2 days or now even 1 day. Anyway, well, I just wanted to fill in
the hospital has quite an interesting history behind it, actually. The original hospital was built really as a memorial to a number of soldiers from this area who died in the Boer War in South Africa in the late 1800, early 1900 time period. And
they were members of the Lord Strathcona Horse.
That's right.
Recruited from here.
Exactly, and it turned out that Lord Strathcona provided half of the money that was required to build the hospital. It was a small hospital, as I recall, it was about 12 beds.
They put up $1,000 for every man that had lost their life.
Yeah, and that proved to be, about half of the cost of the hospital, and then the land was donated by a local farmer. And the reason that he donated the land was that at least half of the lot was a very steep hill, steep wooded hill. So it was unsuitable for farming. And so he made it available for them to build a hospital.
Really?
The nurses who worked in the hospital initially worked, if I remember correctly, there were 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. And of course, we're expected to go to church on Sunday. I mean, that was also one of the requirements. In addition to that, they worked in the garden. The hospital had a sizable garden right up until remarkably recent times. They raised their own ducks. They had a duck pond. They raised their own ducks. And they raised honeybees. And a number of the old board reports were truly fascinating because they would talk about, the potato crop this year and how many bags of potatoes. This was reported to the board because the patients and staff
needed to be fed.
And so as apropos my story to you yesterday, I can just imagine when these nurses are working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, they must have been very hungry. At any rate, it was quite interesting. One of the old board reports from about mid-1950s reported the introduction of the second telephone in the hospital. So the second telephone in the hospital was introduced around about the mid-1950s. I mean, today, I don't know how many thousands of telephones there would be in that hospital, but I'm sure it would be in the thousands. And to realize that mid-1950s there were two.
I'm not going to get into the topic of early physicians in Alberta. I'd rather leave it with Regina to comment on some of them, particularly the Parsons and maybe the other clinic, the Bunn Clinic, will antedate her. But
yeah.
I was going to add a story about Dr. Richard Parsons, the original, about which I managed to learn a little bit. But I think I'll save that unless there's some of the original physicians that you recall.
The first medical staff meeting that I attended, Dr. Malcolm Parsons was there.
Mac.
Yeah. And he introduced himself, and he was very warm and very kind, very hospitable. He retired shortly thereafter. And then Bill Parsons was a radiologist who practiced in the hospital for the first few years that I was here.
Mm-hmm.
So I did know him a bit. I mean, there have been a lot of very special physicians along the way. I remember Bill Unerheim particularly. Was a truly amazing surgeon. He was the go-to surgeon for everybody. And he was a man with quite a remarkable sense of humor. I remember that he always he had a favorite pair of shoes that he wore in the operating theater. And one of the distinguishing features of these scuffed up old tired shoes was they had a lime green shoelace in one and a pink shoelace in the other one. He told me this was so he could differentiate right from left, that he had the pink shoelace in the left shoe and the lime one in the right. And so if he was operating on a patient and it mattered whether it was the right arm or the left arm he was removing, he could check his shoelaces and he knew which one to operate on.
That story sounds rather laced. That's cute. You're reminding me when I was a resident in Edmonton, the head of obstetrics had retired a number of years before. I think the number was 8. But he was a very short man, but he had huge hands, size 8 gloves. And even though he'd been gone 8 years, they were still known as the Vant gloves. You didn't ask for size 8, you asked for the Vant gloves. Some traditions die hard.
Oh, some do. Another of the surgeons who was a most remarkable and very fine man was Doug Marriott. And Doug was a unflappable individual in my dealings with him, and a very good surgeon. There was one day that he called me to the operating room theater, and on the phone he said, Dave, I've got something for you today that I'll bet you've never seen. And he was pretty experienced, so he made it clear it was something he'd never seen. I thought, well, if he's never seen it, and I've never seen it, I wonder just what this could be. So I went up to the OR, and the patient was a young man. A young man in his 20s, and he had presented in the emergency department with abdominal pain. He was traveling from Vancouver to Toronto, and on the way he developed this abdominal pain, become extremely severe, and he ended up in the emergency of our hospital. And it had been concluded that he probably had appendicitis, so Doug had operated on him. Well, it turned out he didn't have appendicitis. He had a bowel obstruction in the terminal ileum, so right in the area of the appendix. And the bowel obstruction was due to a condom. And the condom was full, and the end of it had been tied. So this was most strange. So, I mean, Doug
Took it out.
gave me the condom, and he said, you know, we clearly don't need to record this as a specimen that has caused this young man's troubles. But of course, it needs a bit of explaining to be quite clear. And one of the first things, again, I had wondered about because of my involvement with the RCMP along the way, was this was one means whereby drugs, particularly heroin, was transported.
Mm-hmm.
That people would place the heroin in condoms and swallow them, and this was a way in which they could, you know, get to airports and be undetected.
Right.
And take the heroin. The difficulty is that condoms are porous. They have a very small pore size. So the pore size is not sufficient to allow sperm to penetrate them. But it is large enough that water fluids can pass through. So one of the things that can happen with transporting heroin this way is the heroin can be dissolved to a sufficient extent that it can pass through and become a toxic hazard to the individual. So of course, there's a concern that this is what could be there. And so this young man may very well be you know, on his way to developing heroin toxicity, if indeed this is what has happened. And of course, he was immediate post-surgery, post-anesthesia. They weren't going to get much information from him. So the question was, you know, what can we do to determine what's in this condom? So I phoned a variety of labs because doing an analysis for heroin was certainly beyond our capability, beyond the capability of most standard labs. This isn't something you're asked to do every day, as you can imagine. And finally I found out that there was an RCMP laboratory that was capable of doing this analysis in Edmonton. So we sent this on. But by this time, you know, by the time we started to get results back, they said it's not heroin that's in this. And by this time, of course, the young man is in a position where he can talk and they can have a conversation with him. So he turned out to be quite chastened by what had happened to him. And it turned out that he was in training to be a mule to carry drugs. And this was his first episode. In the first episode, they didn't trust him with heroin, and they filled the condom with honey.
Oh, sweet.
So they filled this condom with honey, tied it up, he swallowed it. It obstructed his intestine, he ended up in our emergency department.
Well, that sounds like a great bees story, or story for the bees,
Well,
to pass around.
I am having told you one politically improper story. Cassandra will cover her ears. Yeah, I will tell you another one. that it was unpolitic. Whenever there were instances of sexual assault, I would be called to determine whether or not a sample from the victim showed live sperm, because this would be useful in terms of determining the
court case.
the timing of the assault. And so from a legal perspective, this had a great deal of relevance. Anyway, one winter's night, there was a terrible instance where the police were called to downtown Red Deer, and there was a young woman who was in a terrible state, and she had almost no clothes, and they picked her up, and she had been assaulted. So she was brought to the emergency department and was examined. And I was called in to determine whether or not there were live sperm present in the sample that had been taken from her. It turned out there were large numbers of them. So I had done my examination, and I walked back to the emergency department in the old hospital, and the physician and the RCMP officer who had attended this lady were there. They met me in the hallway, and they said, "What did you find?" I said, there are live sperm present, large numbers of them. They said, "Well, what does that mean?" I said, "It means that the assault has occurred probably within about the last 2 hours." You should have seen the look on the RCMP officer's face. He looked like somebody hit him with an axe. And the doctor started to laugh like mad. He said, "Do you know where this lady has been for the last 2 hours?" I said, "She's been in RCMP custody." I said, "Well, it's not an exact science. I mean, 2 hours is not restrictive. It could be a bit longer than that." He brightened up noticeably, but I gave him a bit of a bad moment.
Too precise.
Anyway, as I say, I suspect that's an impolitic story for you.
Oh, thank you. You're raising another field in which I'm not sure we can learn a bit or a lot about, and that's the field of physicians outside medicine, and whether you've had much experience with either personally, I guess, or with members of the medical staff who've developed and have had significant outside medicine lives, whether it's writing or whether it's a hobby or something like that, because physicians, are multi-talented and not just talented in the medical field.
Right. There's one of the radiologists who had a passion for astronomy, and he would quite regularly travel to remote parts of the world to witness eclipses. And I remember over the years he did this quite regularly, that he'd be somewhere in the wilds of Africa or South America or wherever. He'd go and watch eclipses. I always thought that was an unusual hobby.
You're reminding me of another member of the medical staff who loved concerts, musical concerts, and would go around anywhere in the continent that there was one, and sometimes beyond it. But if he could, he would never miss one. That was certainly an enjoyment of his and his wife's. Others thought it was more like an obsession.
Well, of course,
it was a form of relaxation.
When it comes to remarkable and amazing physicians, one would have to note K. Swallow, and her collection of the festival carvings, which is quite remarkable. She was an amazing woman, absolutely amazing. I think amongst the many phenomenal individuals here in Red Deer, she was one of them. She was a professor of pediatrics when I was in medical school, and she subsequently left and went to Baltimore, and she became responsible for a section of Baltimore that was very poor, predominantly African American people, and she was basically responsible for the health of their children and their newborns particularly. And one of the problems that this population had were squints. Squints. So they'd have one eye that would look off in a different direction than the other one. And the thing of it that she recognized quite quickly, and I suspect in ophthalmology circles was well known well before that, was that if these babies were operated on shortly after birth, then their vision could be returned and they'd have normal binocular vision. But if this didn't occur, then within a fairly short period of time, the brain would basically shut down one eye.
They develop amblyopia.
Yeah. And the result was that these children would, for the rest of their lives, basically be blind in one eye. So, she'd have large numbers of newborn babies that would fall under her purview, and then she would need to try and screen, and it would be all hours of all days and nights, all days of the week. So she needed some simple mechanism that would allow her to pick out the children that had squint. And what she did was absolutely ingenious. She got a camera, simple camera. These mothers, of course, could not afford a picture of their newborn babies. So what she did was she arranged that with every baby that was born, they took a picture, headshot, head-on picture of these babies. And she would get the picture, and before the mothers went home, this is the time, as you know, they stayed in hospital for a period of time. So before the mother would go home, she could come and she could pick up the picture and take it with her. So in the interim, the picture would be taken, and all these pictures would be laid on her desk when she came in the morning. It turns out that when you've got a light like this one, that the lights reflect off of the eye, and the reflection point should be exactly the same relative to the pupil on each eye.
True.
If it's not, there's a squint. So if one eye is pointed off in the direction, then the light reflex has a different relationship to the pupil of the eye. And so she could look at 30 or 50 pictures of newborn babies and quickly scan them, and within a couple of minutes she could pick out this one and this one and that one, and she knew that these were the kids who needed care, and the rest of them, the mothers had a picture. I always thought that was just amazing.
She was a remarkable lady, and it was one of the highlights when I came back to Red Deer to succeed her at the Mitchell Center. At that time, she was doing medical guardianship reports, and they're the most concise, precise reports I've ever read. She did almost 1,000 of them on residents at Mitchell in preparation for being taken over by the public guardian, who became legally responsible for them, but they needed some supporting evidence. And she wrote those reports and was doing them when I came, even though she had diagnosed herself with ALS, rheumatoid lateral sclerosis. and had
Terrible
Dr.
disease.
Moncton confirm it, because the life expectancy after diagnosis was 3 years, plus or minus, only a few months. So it was sad in that she was deteriorating, as I had the pure pleasure of spending, I used to call it Wednesday nights with Dr. Swallows. And I would go over for an evening and listen to more of her stories. So I was just so delighted that she allowed me into her space and was willing to share, because she never married. I could tell quite a few stories about her as well, but you're right, she was a lady with multiple talents. One was one that bothered everybody else, but not her. She studied the stock market long enough to make a significant amount of money, and then just got tired of it because she found it disinteresting. But she did use her resources because she had an interest in art. And I can remember visiting her at her home, and I went into her study, her office, and she said, "Look around, what do you see?" And I mean, there were lovely paintings, they weren't huge, but I didn't know what they had in common, and I was pretty sure, given their variety, that they weren't by the same artist. And she said, "There's one there from every one of the group of 7.
Really?
And she had a complete set, I think 7 of them.
Wow.
And in her will, it's probably the most refined, educational, if one could ever use it as an example. It was one of those masterpieces. And in her will, she had said to Dr. Tom Chapman, who was her executor, his wife was, both of them were consummate artists, consummate collectors of art. And she said in her will that the funds from the sale of those shall only go to a research fund, a pediatric research fund at the University of Alberta. And a number of years later, I was called, and rather unexpectedly, by people like Chuck Harley and several others to come up to Edmonton, because they were going to have a dedication ceremony for taking the money that she had given them, and had established a resource fund for grants and sending residents off on research trips and so on, using this money. I thought, how nice. The end of it was that, of course, I got asked to give a presentation on Dr. Swallow, and I so remember Chuck Harley sitting in the front row, attentively listening to everything I could say about Dr. Swallow. But what a treat. I know I'm getting a bit off topic, but there were 2 professors, and you'll have a short list too, that you never wanted to be caught in the hallway with, because you couldn't get out, and you were in for a lecture, and it was certainly going to tell you what you didn't know on the subject that was going to be raised. And the 2 were Walter C. Mackenzie and Kathleen Anderson Swallow.
Yeah.
They were 2 of the finest teachers we had, but they sure knew how to teach, and they sure knew how to capture the attention of the students.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned about hobbies and life outside of medicine. I mean, my memory is that Kay went to New York to the Metropolitan Opera on a regular basis. She was an aficionado of quality opera.
The end of your story about Eskimo art is that the focus was mother and child. And she would go way out of her way to collect and acquire only Eskimo art that had that feature to it. So the Red Deer collection, which she gave to the museum, did 2 things. It set the theme and the highlight approach or focus. It also attracted several of her friends to donate their Eskimo art collection to the museum, and as a result, it has one of the better collections, certainly for its size, one of the best collections in the country of Eskimo art. But that's the theme that goes through it. when she was in her later stages, it became very interesting from, I guess, a learning experience. I always think of it, your special people have parts to their lives, and she had parts to hers, and they were completely independent. And she would have this set of friends, the metropolitan friends, the art friends, the travel friends, and aside from the medical friends and pediatric friends that she had, and they would come literally in groups. They were a group of which she was a part, and then they would arrange amongst themselves to come and pay their last respects to her. It was an experience I've certainly never seen before, but that was the nature of the lady. She was a lady of parts, many parts.
Yeah. Oh, she was an amazing individual. And you mentioned Walter Mackenzie. When I finished my residency training, I joined the faculty at U of A, and so Walter Mackenzie was my boss. There was an old Scottish saying that the head of the table was wherever McCrimmon chose to sit. And I always thought this really applied to Walter Mackenzie. And he was a big man. He was an imposing presence. And any room that he was in, there was never any doubt as to, who was the boss in that room. And it was him. I never had an occasion where he raised his voice. He never had to. It was quite clear that, he was a man of considerable substance. Anyway, one of the tasks that I had as a junior member of the faculty was to attend the faculty meetings. We're talking, 500 physicians or more, prima donnas, many of them, egos huge and multiple, in this big amphitheater. And down on the bottom was a desk with Dr. Mackenzie, and somebody was taking notes and so on. And it was amazing theater, absolutely amazing theater. There'd be a topic would be raised on the agenda, and the debate would rage. I never had the good fortune to attend the British Parliament and the rhetoric that would flow back and forth, but I would imagine it would be comparable to this, that the debating skills and the repartee and the ability to provide cloaked insults and so on. It was just amazing to be there and to witness this. Anyway, I didn't realize it until later, but every matter that had to be decided, there was, before the meeting ever started, Dr. Mackenzie would have decided how it should be decided. And he would have planted a motion that would encapsulate what he wanted to happen. So the debate would fly on, you see, for 10 minutes or whatever. And he'd say, time for the question. And the planted motion would be read out and duly seconded. And then was the fascinating part. He would call for those who voted aye. And of course, they would put up their hand. Every motion, he wanted it it was positive. You were never confused as to whether you should vote for it or against it. The dean wanted you to vote for it, and let there be no doubt. So the ayes, he'd call for the ayes. And then he would call for those who are contrary-minded. And God help you if you were contrary-minded there were a few things on God's green earth that you wanted less than to be contrary minded.
To Walter.
For Walter Mackenzie.
I don't know whether I could regularize that relationship very well. I started Surgery A, which was his team, the day he went in for his first cancer operation. And I could relate some stories that are perhaps a little too personal about that next week, but residents weren't allowed to treat him except the chief resident. And of course, his IV went interstitial, and his special nurse was something below average, which was unfortunate. But he survived, and so did the surgeon, Les Willicks, that operated on him. The tragedy was, of course, that about 10 years later, he developed either a primary or a recurrence, and it was fatal the second time. And the province lost certainly a leader in medical terms, and the naming of the Walter Mackenzie Center after him is just so appropriate. There's never been and probably never will be a man of his magnitude and insight and vision and international reputation. Aside from the fact that he was known as Mr. Academic Surgeon on the continent, but he was president of over half of the 25 organizations he used. He was certainly remarkably influential. As somebody said, he was known from Edmonton to Moscow and parts in between. He left such an impact. But I will, I guess, make a somewhat personal comment about Walter. I had many other stories I could add to him, but one of the privileges I've had living in Red Deer is you're situated halfway between Calgary and Edmonton, so you see, I call it like a tennis match. You're looking at one way and then the other and back and forth, but you recognize talent in both. And I've had the luxury of nominating all of the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame physicians who've been inducted into it over about 15 years, except for the last two that have been acknowledged. And the second last one I nominated was Dr. Mackenzie, and it was Lauren Terrell, of course, that signed off as the other nominator, he being one of the more recent deans. I just think it's such a privilege because that group included Dr. McKechnie, we were talking about earlier, as the very first medical inductee, and Peter Lougheed and Dr. Jack Bradley for starting the HFMR, as well as Dr. Terrell and Dr. Mackenzie. And Dr. Cochran. So it's been a luxury on my part. On one hand, a vacuum because I thought these people deserved recognition, needed it, and usually on my first application it was accepted. So I've been able to give some of the pioneering physicians recognition that they might not otherwise have had. And I suppose the one that pleased me most was Peter Lougheed, because I read that you could be inducted into the Hall of Fame and not be a physician because they had inducted Tommy Douglas. Mm-hmm. My 42nd cousin was his secretary for 40 years, so I knew I could tell a few stories about Tommy Douglas. But I thought if they could induct him, then I will try with Peter Lougheed. And so I've been very fortunate to get him honored, not only in that fashion, but as the I think recipient of the Medal of Honor that the CMA annually give out to a non-physician. Mm-hmm. So it's been, I won't call it a Red Deer tradition, but certainly reflects one of the geographical advantages that Red Deer has in recognizing talent that one city may not recognize in another for whatever parochial or other reasons. So that's certainly a spin-off from that.
You mentioned about Peter Lougheed. When the regional hospital was dedicated, approximately 1981, when it was first opened, Peter Lougheed came down and he gave the presentation and so on that opened the hospital. And one of the interesting things was that without having warned him ahead of time, the hospital board gave him a check. This was the first time that a hospital had actually been built in the province under budget. I'm not dead sure that that's true, but that's what we were told at the time, was that it was the first time that, and it wasn't a big check, but it was a check. And I'll never forget that his observation that he'd opened a lot of hospitals, but it was the first time anybody had ever given him money back.
I don't have any example like that, except I would think it would be the last one, and if there was money on the table they'd be looking for. Because there were some rules in the province that were pretty tough to live with after you had a new expansion. One was that you couldn't make requests for new equipment or anything else that was supposedly included in the original cost estimates and was supposed to have been purchased at the time. So giving back money, I'm not sure the medical staff would have been very ecstatic about that. Had they known about it.
I'm not sure who decided to do it, nor how widely it was advertised ahead of time, but that was what was done.
The other story that I'll try and red your eyes a little is your use of the word McCrimmon.
Oh yes.
There was a chap by the name of Willie McCrimmon who became famous in the Jake and the Kid stories that were written by W.O. Mitchell.
Yeah.
And it turned out that my grandfather married W.O. Mitchell's parents on the farm because the Presbyterian church he was building in Weyburn was not finished or at a point where they could have a wedding. So when my mother, coming off the farm in a place called Trossachs near Weyburn, had to go to Weyburn to finish her grade 12. Some interesting things happened, but W.O. Mitchell was a little older than she was, but he had a younger brother, I think his name was Peter, that she dated while she was in Weyburn in grade 12. Well, one of the stories is about Willie McCrimmon, the curler who was going to go to hell. Because that was his deal with the devil. If he was allowed to win the Canadian Brier, he would go to hell. That was the price he'd have to pay to the devil. So he thought about it for a while, and he said, well, maybe if I actually play the devil and I beat him, I can save my soul. And so our family used to always go to any bonspiel, major bonspiel that had as a part of it showing of the story of the bonspiel of Willie McCrimmon. So anyway, when Dad passed away in 1997, one of the thoughts was we'll get a mural made of Willie McCrimmon, the bonspiel of Willie McCrimmon, because he always had to attend anyone who was within 100 miles. So we went to Keith Holmes, another prominent Red Deer family, Holmes Drug Store. And Keith was a muralist, and he came up with an initial rendering, not on that topic, but eventually we got a bit persistent, said, we can do better, and we don't want just something in the stairwell. So he came back with this Willie McCrimmon rendering, and it's 4 feet by 55 in size.
Oh boy.
And that was fine, so we put it above 4 sheets of ice. And then we thought about it and thought, well, if that's Dad's, then there should be one for Mother. So we went back to Keith Holmes and said, would you do another one? And he said, yeah, I'll do the last bones, the last end where I win. And it's 4 feet by 56 feet. And it hangs now, the two of them hang now in the barn in the Red Deer curling rink. With a little note saying, this is the bonspiel about Willie McCrimmon saving his soul. But the last part to the story, was that I knew W.O. was not in good health. He was passing away from cancer, I think of the prostate, and his wife developed cancer as well in the last couple of months. I couldn't reach him. The protective net around him wouldn't allow correspondence or anything else to get through him, phone calls or whatever. I found him, I knew where he lived in Calgary, and short of going down and knocking on his door. Fortunately, Tommy Douglas's secretary got wind of the fact that I was trying to, obviously through Mother, to run down or access the Mitchell family. So they gave me the address, and I was able to contact them and get assurances that I could write a letter and they would open it. So I did, and just asked them for approval to do this mural, because he had copyright, proprietorship, whatever you want to call it, over the story. So anyway, I got a beautiful letter back from the family saying yes, they had made him aware of it and he had quite approved. So that's one of the heirlooms that I have, is the story about Mother and the Mitchell family, my grandfather, and that's the background to that mural that hangs in the Red Deer curling rink, dedicated to Mother and Dad. But it's part of one of the things I love to do, which is to take a historical story or facet and make it current, and that was one I was able to.
I have to go and see those murals now.
Yeah, oh, there.
W.O. wrote that story, didn't he, about William McCrum. As I recall, he defeated the devil by, he had a nail in his shoe, and at the critical moment in the match, the nail worked its way through into the devil's foot, and he missed the shot. Is that not correct?
He missed his last shot. I'm missing the nail in the coffin part of it, but.
Well, it was a nail on the sole of his shoe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't recall the specifics now, except the fact that the nail worked its way through into the devil's foot just at the critical moment when he was making a shot, and he missed it. He saved William McCrimmon's soul.
Well, I'm extending the story because only indirectly related to Red Deer, but the Jake and the Kid story are very intertwined with our family, because a number of the experiences, examples that W.O. referred to relate to our family. And the church he refers to his grandfather's church. Broken Shell, my grandfather was the secretary of the municipality of Broken Shell. But the most significant to our family story is one Thanksgiving Dad had taken the family out for dinner, one of the restaurants in town, and we were eating away, and I well remember it was a half-shape seating arrangement. And just as we were starting, in walked W.O. Mitchell and the person who was hosting it, because he'd been the highlight guest speaker at the hospital convention that had been held in Red Deer. And we'd heard all these stories from Mother over the years. So we were all wondering, are they true? Are they real? So we finished our dinner, and of course their table was a little later than ours. And we kind of looked over at his table because it was right next to ours. And then we look at Mother and say, well, I wonder what's going to happen. Of course, as soon as we were finished, Mother said, can I get up? So she got up, and she went over to the Mitchell table, and she stood in front of him. And he was seated there, and all of us, of course, were going like this, trying to figure out what's going to happen now. And in a classic W.O. Mitchell move, you could just see his head, busy in conversation, noting what he initially must have thought was the waitress. And his eyes and his head just went up like this, and he was out of his seat, and he threw his arms around her, and he yelled the only time in my life I've ever heard Mother called by her maiden name, Sadie Leslie. So of course the rest of us were just cheering. Normally the story would end there, but I had some communication with the Mitchell family afterwards. And eventually, in the usual, release of books before Christmas, trying to get sales, I came across a book called The Best of W.O. Mitchell. And so I thought, I've got my Christmas present for Mother. So I looked through the book and very quickly went through the table of contents, and there was a chapter. It just said Sadie, and I knew that would be Mother. Mm-hmm. So I quickly opened the book and went to the chapter about Sadie. To my horror, Sadie ran the Ladies of the Evening House.
Oh no.
And I thought, well, that does not fit. I bought the book anyway, and before I allowed Mother to open it, I filled her in with a little bit of this story. She just turned to me, she said, "That's W.O."
Of course,
And
yes.
I was just so appreciative of the way they handled it, but it was just such a moving event for our family, and knowing all of the background to it, and the way it ended in such a classic W.O. Mitchell fashion. So that's the background to the mural and the mural story, and I hope someday it gets told or reposited somewhere. I guess now it is in video form, but we're a little removed from our topic, but that is a Red Deer story.
Stories are amongst the most valuable things that we have. And certainly I came to realize over the years that, when patients share their stories with you, it often was the most valuable thing that they had. And they were pearls of great price. I love narratives, I love stories.
Well, the many years that you published that newsletter, just full of stories, about medicine, but about people too. And I was always amazed at the breadth of your knowledge and what would suddenly come out in a story unexpectedly, like the time you referred to Earl Scarlett's book. It's the only time in my life I've ever heard it referenced, Earl being a mentor of mine. I will pick up on, just very quickly, on your brief reference to Dr. McGregor Parsons. The Parsons lived 2 doors away, and in between was Kerry Wood.
Oh, wow.
In the years that I was growing up. So we knew the Parsons family quite well, and very sadly, Mac died of bronchogenic carcinoma. But he, and it was through Walter Mackenzie, because the two of them were very close friends. He was recommended and eventually became the president of the Canadian Medical Association, an honor that no Red Deer physician has yet to subsequently receive. But there is a scrapbook on him that Lil Scott put together that the museum has. But what I remember about that year of his was not about the year in the details, although he did the sod turning at the opening of the Foothills Hospital in 1959 with Donovan Ross. But what I remembered was that he was elected the president of the CMA the year after the only physician that I know of that's ever been elected president of the CMA, and that non-physician was the Duke of Edinburgh.
Oh.
And he was the man who succeeded the Duke of Edinburgh as president of the CMA.
That's amazing.
But there's another Red Deer story of a very significant physician in the history of surgeons and so on of Red Deer. David, I think now that we're getting warmed up, we could go on quite a long time as each one of us stimulate the others. But are there other community interests and so on that you've had over the years, or other physicians have made a significant contribution to? I say that in a kind of a sad note that one of the things I learned from Dr. Scarlett was the phrase medical truants. And truants were physicians by training or interest or both, who became very successful and well known outside medicine. People like Conan Doyle. And he was very, and could tell some marvelous stories about how he developed his own avocational interests. And I love to tell that story. I won't now, but I've been saddened that over the years, some physicians, in a century back or more, were very prominent people in their community. They were one of the few that were university educated. They had broad interests, either they're called upon, civic politics or whatever, or they had them. And the breadth of contributions from some of the pioneering physicians is quite broad.
Yes.
Like Dr. Bunn was the mayor of Red Deer a couple of times. But they could marry those, and the community looks upon them for that kind of leadership. So I make those comments only as background to say, do you recall any experiences either you've had with the United Way and some of the work that you've done in the Red Deer Hospital Foundation that have had an impact, that have had a legacy? And I know you've had some.
You mentioned about the foundation. When the first MRI was purchased here in Red Deer, I can't give you a date for that right now, but I would think would be around 2000, thereabouts. I was paired with Michael Daw as a couple that were to go out and try to raise money for this. And that was quite an experience, quite an adventure. I was amazed at what a wonderful gentleman Michael is, at the number of people that he knew. Practically anywhere that you went, if there were two or more were gathered together, the likelihood was that one, if not both, were known to Michael. So that was one thing that was quite amazing. And he had this uncanny, wonderful capacity for meeting people and putting them at ease very quickly. At any rate, we went out and we were able to talk to quite a number of people within and around Red Deer. And I was amazed at how well received we were and how generous so many people were. And I remember that one of the fears that the college and other institutions within the community had, that because we were getting so much in the way of donations, that there would be nothing left for them. And about a year or so later, I had occasion to talk to somebody who was involved with the United Way, and they kind of were aware of the bigger picture. And I found it quite fascinating that they said that the year that we had gathered so much money, that the college had amongst its best, and that people simply donated to anything and everything. And I thought that was a mark of Red Deer, a mark of the community that we are.
Yeah, I think there's.
But I remember the United Way, and once again, you realize what a wonderful community this is when you go out and ask people to contribute to things. They do.
When I was asked to join the United Way board, it certainly wasn't an opportunity I could say no to, because my father was the first board chairman. And around the kitchen table were the stories about how difficult it was to start something in Red Deer and continue it. Because the kind of people you'd like to rely on, the talented people, came and went so quickly. I think I've referred to that, but the other thing I remember is that I was responsible for community organizations, corporations, the oil and gas sector, and the health sector. And I well remember going to David asking for assistance. And the irony is that behind that is what's called a budget. And you're expected to at least achieve in fundraising as much as you did last year, and here's the percentage we'd like to add. And I remember of all the calls that I made asking for assistance and canvassing and so on, the shortest one was my call to David Dawson, who said, yes, I will certainly help. And the other thing that struck me was at the end of the day when the funds were counted up, that we were at least 20% over the previous year. Mm-hmm. And I thought how you have to ask the right person, the willing person, the person who's knowledgeable, the person who's effective, and it shows. Mm-hmm. And that was one of my memorable experiences from the couple of years that I was on the United Way board. And I say thank you again, David, for helping me make me look better than I might have otherwise.
You couldn't be more welcome. I loved being on the United Way board. It was truly a fascinating and wonderful thing to be a part of. During the time that I was there, most of the board members were in finance one way or another. They were bankers, accountants, financiers, etc., or highly successful businessmen who obviously knew their way around finance. I was the individual who knew the least by far of how to manage finances. So, I mean, the good Lord works in strange ways. They decided that they needed a budget committee, and they decided that they needed someone who would have a non-finance perspective on this. So I was selected to be a member of this particular group. They set a time and a place for the first meeting. I felt a bit intimidated by the whole prospect. I decided that I was going to prepare myself to go. So I bought a box of pencils and sharpened them. And I got a pad of paper. And I appeared at the meeting. And I had my calculator, box of sharp pencils, and my pad of paper. And I was ready to go. And I was greeted with gales of laughter. Said nobody who was a banker or an accountant or whatever uses pencils. They always all use mechanical pencils. They said, you stand out like a sore thumb, Dave, you know. You're the only one here who's actually got pencils. From then on, I got myself a mechanical pencil.
That's a sharp story.
Yeah.
With a lot of lead in it. I would like to go back to one of your comments or stories about getting the right blood for an exchange transfusion. I do remember that the pediatric nurses used to call me when they had a preemie and they needed 15 mils of blood to match for the exchange transfusion. They would call me, because I was the only one in the university hospital who knew how to puncture the femoral vein and draw it up, but that's not the nature of my story. It's about the blood drives, and they were certainly a very characteristic program that was provided blood free of charge that came out of the war. And the cadets in Red Deer in general, and Mother in particular, became, said they would take on the blood drives and do the canvassing part of it. And over the years, they would meet in our rumpus room, and it was a very smoke-filled room by the time they were finished, characteristic of the era. But they would mail out all these reminder cards to people who had donated before, which we do now in a different manner. But the response in central Alberta, primarily Red Deer, was increasingly significant to a point where the cadets would organize 2 clinics a year, and at each one there would be at least 1,000 pints donated. And Red Deer at that time might have had a population of, I don't know, 10,000, not much more. So it was a significant part of the community, and there was a lot of pride in the community about people who donated 50, 100, 150, I think Mother and Dad hit. But Red Deer became, for its size, the capital for blood drives in Canada. They collected more blood in Red Deer clinics at that time than anywhere else in Canada. And sadly, of course, there were some other problems that evolved out of that, but that was another definition of Red Deer and the people in Red Deer and their willingness, if it was well organized and needed and there was a good story to go with it, people in Red Deer performed. And that was a classic example of it.
During the first several years that I was here, when I first came, major hemorrhagic emergencies would require that we bleed donors. So we would go to these lists and identify people of the appropriate type. We would phone them and they would come in. And the interesting thing was that we always got good responses. But the best response was at night. If you phone at 2 a.m. People in Red Deer and ask them to come in and donate blood, you'll get large numbers of people, there's no question about it. If you phone during the day, the men are off at work, and the women, if they are at home, if they're not at work, they're home with children. And so it's much more difficult to get donors, interestingly, during the day than it is to get them at night. But I'll just tell you one kind of quick story of blood donations. Again, middle of winter, bad roads, major blizzard. Middle of the night, I get a phone call from a distant rural center. A lady had just given birth and she was bleeding and the bleeding wouldn't stop. And so the physician had actually phoned me because of the fact that he knew that if she was still alive when they arrived by ambulance, they were going to need blood and they were going to need lots of it. So he had phoned, that was one reason. But the second reason was that he suspected she wasn't going to live. He said she had no pulse and they were some distance from Red Deer still. And that at that point in time, the EEGs were done by the laboratory.
The ECGs or
EEGs.
EEGs.
And he wanted an EEG done upon arrival to determine whether or not there was any brain activity at all. So it turned out that they arrived. We had some blood available for them right away. But at that point in time, when the old hospital was in place, the routine was that people would be called, they would come in, I would put a needle in their arm and take a unit of blood, and when I was done, they would go down to the local nursing unit, and there was one lady, one nurse, who worked permanent nights, and she made coffee. And she made coffee that was extraordinarily potent. So, in return for a unit of blood, people got a cup of Mrs. Pugh's coffee. And they left the hospital wide awake, absolutely wide awake, no question about it. The headlights were on bright when they left. But that particular night, the lady was in the OR, which was actually near the lab at the time. I'll never forget. We took 30 or 40 units of blood from people of Red Deer that night, and this patient received them all. By the time the donors were done and had had their cup of coffee and were ready to walk out of the hospital, they had to walk by the OR. And this patient's mother was there. And she stopped every blood donor and gave them a hug. It was very, very moving. But it certainly was a measure of just how extremely important it was. She realized that her daughter wasn't going to survive without this.
And the outcome was?
It was, she was not returned to full health, but she survived, and the baby survived too.
Well, I have a parallel story, but I'll tell it privately.
Okay.
The outcome was successful, but it was akin to that, but had a magnitude to it that was much like yours. Maybe not 40 pints of blood, that's a lot.
Oh yeah. No, it was, she
When
was
you think the body has, what, 5 pints of blood, maybe 6?
Yeah.
And you get into complications just because you're using somebody else's blood with time. Anyway, it's been marvelous. I think that David and I could, now that we're started, we could continue for quite some time and would enjoy doing it. David, it's been a distinct privilege to reconnect, but also to share some of these stories, obviously one leading to another about Red Deer and about the two of us and what we've either learned by reading or learned by experiencing it. I'd love to extend some, but I have tried to leave a little bit of space for Regina to talk a little more about the medical staff, and I look forward to doing that in due course. But I can't say thank you enough for such a delightful 2 occasions. I hope the rest turn out to be as interesting and as chatty as these have. So thank you very much, and thank Diane too for carving out the time for us.
You're most welcome. Most welcome.
Great pleasure.
Thank you for coming to our home.